Unit 9 is a brief history of writing systems in general, i.e. around the world. All right. The earliest writing systems we have found date back to around 5,000 years ago. And they were clay tablets with various little inscriptions on them. And they survived because they were fired, and clay, when it's fired, hardens, becomes like an old clay pot, and then they get broken and thrown in a pile or something, and we find them later. In any case, why did they need records? Well, they were really business transactions. How many jars of olive oil and how much grain, etc. And why did they need to write that down? Well, there's an old Chinese proverb that says, the palest ink is better than the best memory. And indeed, writing things down has turned out to be an extremely valuable tool for life. And as time went on, we would find more and more records with things like laws and regulations and declarations by kings. Now, let's talk about this system of writing. Very complicated. The earliest symbols were pictures of real objects, which gradually simplified to the point they became very abstract. Indeed, only trained scribes could create or write them. Let's take a preview from this chart. You'll see how this chart shows you that the letter A in modern day times started out as the picture of an ox's head. It became somewhat abstracted here, even more so, and then it started to turn over into its current position. Let's take the next one. Alpha, beta, bait. Bait was house in Semitic, actually. And then this was a kind of a house with a doorway, and then it became that, and then this. Or take a door. Daleth, door, became delta and became D. Man shouting became that symbol, epsilon E. Look at this one, twisted rope evolved into that, and then into Greek eta. This column, by the way, is Greek. And this is the original pictures, and these are the somewhat stylized. So notice that water, and then became M, but the Greek alphabet is the key, because what the Greeks did was they borrowed this writing system and changed it into an alphabet. And we'll be talking about that more in a minute. Okay, so let's give an example of how complicated this early writing system was by using Egyptian hieroglyphs. As you know, we found them on many monuments in Egypt, and they are well documented, and we have many examples. And so that's why this is the easiest way to give you an example of these very early writing systems. Now, this writing system started off with pictures of animals, as we just saw. Then they became more abstract. But the basic symbol in this writing system was words. They captured words for the most part. So each symbol was designed to talk about a word. And present-day Chinese uses a word symbol. We'll come back to that. There were also some symbols in Egyptian hieroglyphics which represented syllables. And syllables is perhaps a writing system is based on syllables, probably because native speakers can recognize syllables. You can get them to hear the syllables in a word. And present-day Japanese, for example, uses a syllable system for its writing. And occasionally in hieroglyphics, we would find syllable symbols used to represent a consonant or a vowel. But this seemed to be an adaptation of the syllable system when the language had a complicated pattern to represent, such as an initial consonant grouping. But it is still obvious to this day that the words the scribes were trying to sign were symbols representing words, and they occasionally used symbols that were syllable symbols to represent certain aspects of speech. And so, albeit it was so complicated that scribes had to become specially taught, and it was a skill that had to be learned. And because many of these word signs were quite arbitrary, almost anything, it started with a picture, yes, but after it became abstract, as you just saw, you basically had to memorize it. And so it was a very specialized skill in ancient Egypt. Now, what happened, as we saw in the chart before, is picture, abstract symbol, and then the Greeks borrowed this system from the Phoenicians. The Phoenicians were traders. By that I mean they traded goods in the Mediterranean. So they got all around in their little boats. And of course, they ran into the Greeks doing this. But their language was a Semitic language, just as the Egyptian hieroglyphs were Semitic. And because of that, when the Greeks borrowed this system, they found that it really didn't fit Greek very well, because Greek is a very different language family from this, the Semitic language family. So they reorganized and reused these symbols. And the way they did it was they created each symbol was either a consonant or a vowel. And that was a tremendous change. Native speakers are not aware normally of consonants and vowels as separate. They are aware of syllables, but you have to teach them to peel off the consonant from the vowel. And this is one of the reasons why to this day, most people have to learn to read. It doesn't come naturally. You have to actually learn the alphabetic principle as part of learning to read. But back to the Greeks, because they came up with this alphabet, and when they did it, they wrote phonemes. So they were really very clever people. As you know, you've seen them referenced again and again and again in other sources of history of things, inventions, etc. And so when they did this, they represented phonemes, not allophones, and they represented the phonemes of Greek. And so alphabets from their beginning were an attempt to fit a symbol to the spoken language. And other scribes back in here did not understand the phonemic principle, and so used confusing symbols or symbol combinations, which were confusing even to native speakers. As I said, you had to be educated even to be a scribe. Over time, languages changed, and so did the symbols. But the Greek alphabet, which fit Greek fine, was over time, it didn't fit very well. And I said, well, why? Why is that? Well, if we go back to our chart, the Greek alphabet came along about 3,000 years ago. And the alphabets, as I said, attempt to represent phonemes. And in that sense, the Greek alphabet was a great alphabet. It represented Greek quite well. But even today, it doesn't exactly represent Greek as well as it could. But languages change. And so there are two factors going on. One, the Greeks created the alphabet. The Romans borrowed, quote unquote, the Greek alphabet to represent Latin. They had to rearrange the symbols because Greek was not the same as Latin. And so they fiddled with the alphabet. Then the English speakers borrowed the Latin alphabet for English. Well, you can see this process each time the language doesn't quite fit the symbols, and so there's some readjustment and refiguring, etc. And that creates one major problem for alphabets, but there's an even bigger problem. The English alphabet today does not represent the English spoken in 1500. Why? Because languages change. You can see this if you look at Shakespeare. Shakespeare's pronunciation is certainly not the same as ours 500 years later. Why do languages change? This is a key concept. We need to talk about this. Often people say, well, languages change because people are sloppy. This is not true. There is a very simple reason why languages change. All children, when they learn a language, are forced to copy it from those around them. Now, how else would they get it? They hear it and they copy it and make it their own. But there's a simple fact about copying. Copying always introduces errors. There is no such thing as a perfect copy, which is perfectly like the original. One example of this is if you take a photocopy of something, and then you photocopy that photocopy and keep on photocopying it, what you'll find is eventually it just sort of disappears. It becomes all vague and hard to see. Well, why is this? It's because each copy creates a certain amount of change, and that change eventually results in something that's not at all like the original. Okay, back to children learning language. When they copy language, they introduce error or change. And that's simply the way it is. And let's try a little thought experiment to illustrate this fact. Now, if you think about the language spoken by your parents, you think that it's identical to your language. But sometimes you can find small differences. But go back to your grandparents, if you're lucky enough to have them alive, and listen to them carefully, and you'll find there are differences between their speech and yours. Well, now, if you extend that down to a number of generations, you can see what I mean about language changing. Okay, now since language is changing and alphabets attempt to represent phonemes, over time, phonemes change and you have problems. So the American English alphabet suffers from two major problems. One, it was borrowed from Greek, from Latin, etc., but also English has changed over time. Alphabets tend to be conservative. They tend to stay the same. And when that happens, they don't fit the language as well as they should. But this is true of many, many languages around the world. They started off with a good alphabet in many cases, but then as the language changes, they wind up with an alphabet that's really not fitting very well. So this is a brief unit, a brief description of how writing systems evolved, of what they try to do, and how they changed over time to evolve into the alphabet, but also how once it became an alphabet for a given language, the language then changed, creating further problems. So remember, even today, the Chinese use a system, a writing system that's basically word symbols. And the Japanese use a system of writing that's basically syllables. So even today, we do not have alphabets everywhere in the world. But we do have alphabets for most languages. The alphabet has spread and covered most languages, but not perfectly, as I just described. And this brings us to the end of Unit 9.